In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how I drew this buffalo step by step and give you some of my biggest tips for drawing realistically with pastels. I'm Kirsty Rebecca and I make drawing and painting tutorials that are easy to follow even if you're just starting out. For this piece, I'm going to be using the Conte crayons and some pastel pencils. If you want to follow along with a real-time version of this tutorial that's 4.5 hours long where I talk you through the entire process step by step, I have that available on my Patreon channel, so I'll leave a link in the description if you want to check it out. So I'm working on my favourite paper, which is Clairefontaine Pastel Mat, and there's actually no other paper that's similar to the pastel mat. It's definitely not the same as generic papers labelled as pastel paper because you can add way more layers than those generic papers and you end up with a much smoother, nicer result. And I like to start with a toned colour. In this case, I'm using a yellow because of the colours that are in the buffalo itself. There are quite a lot of warm colours there, so I've started out with a yellow, but any sort of mid-tone colour will be just fine. And the reason that I like to start with a toned paper is because you can add darker colours and lighter colours instead of having to work around your highlights working from light to dark. It's actually a lot easier to work this way because you can add your highlights in there as well as your shadows throughout the entire process. Usually I actually start out with pan pastels. Most of my tutorials are using pan pastels, but I actually wanted some texture to show through in the underlayers and the background. So I decided to go with my Conte crayons. And these are kind of like a hard pastel stick. They're a lot harder than most other pastels. They are still considered a soft pastel, so they're not an oil pastel or anything like that. They are still a soft pastel, but they're really quite hard. And you can actually blend them relatively smoothly if you continue to layer, but if you only have a couple of layers on your piece, then they do tend to add quite a bit of texture. So I wanted some of that in this piece because it is quite a textured piece. So I'm going for an out of focus look with this background, adding some warmer yellows, oranges and browns, and also some darker colours towards the edges and corners. And having slightly darker corners and edges will help bring the viewer's attention back to the centre of the piece. So it will bring more attention to the face of the buffalo. I'm just using the Conte sticks on the side to cover a larger area more quickly. And I'll be building up the layers on the background and blending in between each layer just to get a nice soft look. The first few layers will tend to look a little bit grainy, but once you've blended it out and added a few more layers, it will look a lot softer. And if you're doing a base layer and you're not using the pan pastels, you don't want to use a soft pastel stick that's too soft because soft pastel sticks tend to fill up the tooth of the paper quite quickly and you won't be able to add pastel pencil on top if you want to add any details to your piece. And what I mean by the tooth is that any paper that you're working on has sort of like hills and valleys, which people call the tooth. And what happens is when your pigment glides across your paper, it catches on the hills and then deposits into the valleys. And eventually your valleys get filled up and it becomes level with the hills, which will make a slick surface that is very hard for your pastel pencils or sticks or anything to grab onto that surface anymore. So you won't be able to add any more layers once you fill up the tooth. So try and use a pastel like pan pastel where you can control how much pastel you're adding in your base layer, or you can use a harder pastel like the Conte sticks to do your base layers with. You can use other pastels, but just keep in mind that if you add too much pastel, it will be hard to go on top. So moving on to the buffalo, I'm using the Conte sticks as a base layer for my pastel pencils. So I'm using the tips of the sticks to get a bit more control in each area of the buffalo. I'm really exaggerating the colours that I'm seeing in my reference photo here, adding a lot more of the blues and the purples just to make it a bit more interesting. For the background, I added many layers to get a nice build up of pastel and create a smooth, soft look. But for the underpainting, I don't want too much pastel in this layer, so I can preserve some of that tooth to add pastel pencil on top. So with my underpaintings, I like to do a slightly darker sort of mid-tone colour with much more vibrant colours than what I want my end result to be. And as my layers develop, I slowly add more natural colours, which dulls down that vibrant base layer that I usually add to begin with. And the reason that I like to do it this way is because some of those vibrant colours show through in the end result, and I really love that effect of those subtle, vibrant colours coming through. It just gives it a lot more depth and interest in the piece. So in between each layer of pastel that I do, I always blend out with a cotton tip or my finger or a blending stump. And the reason that I recommend blending your pastel in between each layer is because it creates a smoother result in the end because you're not layering scribbly pastel over more scribbly layers of pastel. You're actually smoothing out each layer as you go, so it creates a smoother result in the end. It also helps with the pastel dust and how much falls off of your piece. So when you push the pigment into the tooth of the paper, you're getting rid of a lot of that pastel dust that sits on the surface. So when you're working on it, or when you go to store it or frame it or move it and things like that, less of that pastel dust will be there to fall off. And also blending the pastel pushes it into the tooth of the paper, which also allows you to add more layers on top as well. So when it comes to your initial outline, I wouldn't recommend freehanding onto your pastel mat directly, because graphite can actually leave a sort of shiny effect that the pastels sometimes don't stick to very well. And the graphite doesn't really erase very well on pastel mat. So if you make any mistakes or you want to move things or whatever, it doesn't really work that well when you're erasing and changing things on your pastel mat paper. So I'd suggest to either do your initial sketch on a separate piece of paper or print out your reference photo to the same size as your artwork and then transfer that to your pastel mat. So the two main ways that I recommend transferring your initial sketch or the reference photo is to use a transfer paper that isn't graphite based. So again, with the graphite, it sometimes creates that shiny effect that pastel sometimes doesn't stick to. So try and avoid the transfer papers that have graphite. But the other way that's actually quite easy is to rub pastel onto the back of your drawing or your reference photo. So you can use pan pastel to do that. It's quite an easy way to cover the back of your reference photo or your initial sketch, and then turn the reference photo or your sketch the right way up on top of your pastel mat, and then trace over the lines, and the pastel that's on the back will come through onto your pastel mat and create an outline that is pastel based, which will blend in with your future layers. So you won't have any issues with any graphite or shiny effects or anything like that with the outline. Moving on to the pastel pencils. I like to leave any detailed areas like the eyes for pastel pencils because it's a bit easier to get those finer details in, and I won't accidentally lose my outline by using pastel sticks in those areas. I'll be adding a few layers of the pencil, so I'm not too worried about getting too much detail at the moment. I'm just trying to get some of the textures there and then start to adjust some of my values, like making my shadows darker. I'll be blending this layer out before adding more layers, so I'm keeping that in mind as well, because any small details that I add in this layer will actually be blended out anyway, and so you won't see them, and I'll end up having to redo them in the following layers. People sometimes ask, how do I know what section or what colour to work on next, or what order I do things in, and to be honest, I don't really have an exact method that I follow each time. I just look at my reference photo, and whichever colour or value jumps out the most to me, I'll start with that. So in this layer, the dark shadows on the horns were standing out to me the most. So I started with that colour, and while I had that colour in my hand, I continued down onto the head or anywhere else I can see that same colour in my reference photo. And then I'll move on to the next most obvious colour and add that wherever I see it on my photo as well, and just keep continuing on like that. And I always recommend to tape your work down, and the reason for that is because it ends up with a really nice border around the outside that you can hold on to. So when you're moving your piece around, or you're storing it, or you're framing it and things like that, so having that border around the edge that's clean gives you something to hold on to rather than having to hold on to the actual pastel artwork itself. It also looks nice to have that border around the outside if you're going to ship your artwork before it gets framed and things like that. It looks nice like that. And it also helps to keep your artwork still so it's not moving around while you're drawing. And instead of taping your work to your desk, I actually recommend taping it to a board, because that way you can actually move that board. So if you want to get a better angle for certain areas with your hand, you can just rotate the board around and then have a more comfortable angle to work with. And also when you get excess pastel dust, instead of blowing away the pastel dust or trying to brush it away with your hand, you can just pick up the board, go to a bin, and then turn it upside down and tap off the excess dust. So that way it's a lot cleaner and easier to get rid of the dust that way. So when you're working on any animals with fur or feathers or anything like that, you want to make sure that any pencil strokes or pastel strokes that you add to your piece goes in the right direction. So make sure that your strokes are going in the same direction that the fur is going in. You also want to make sure that it's the same length as the fur, so don't do really short strokes in any areas that have really long fur, because it's going to make that long fur look short because of the stroke that you did with your pencil. So any marks that you make with your pencil, you want it to add to that texture of the piece rather than having it go in the wrong direction and have it look odd. But that being said, when you're adding fur detail, you don't want it all to be exactly in line in the same direction, just lining up like a picket fence. You want to make sure that you vary your strokes, so have some start in a different spot than others or curve slightly. Just make them a little bit different to each other, even though they are still going in the same general direction. So before I move on to the next part, If you want to follow along with my longer real-time tutorials where I talk you through every step of the process, then Patreon might be the solution for you. For a small amount per month, you'll have access to every tutorial that I've previously uploaded on your chosen tier level in a variety of mediums like pastel, coloured pencil, graphite, watercolour and more. You will also have access to the original reference photo, a traceable outline, and a list of supplies that I'm using so you really can follow along every step of the way. My tutorials don't skip any stages or cut out any important parts of the process, and I will share all of my secrets to help you improve. Every month, I will upload brand new tutorials to the library so you can grow and develop your drawing and painting skills and take your art to the next level. You can also join in on our members chat group where you can ask questions or advice or share your artwork and talk to other members in the Patreon community. The link is in the description if you want to check it out. When it comes to sharpening pastel pencils, a lot of people have issues with this, and I spent so long researching how to sharpen pastel pencils when I first started. I ended up trying just so many different sharpeners and wasting a lot of money on sharpeners to find the perfect one for pastel pencils. And the reality is there isn't really a sharpener that's good for pastel pencils. And a lot of people say that the manual crank handle sharpeners like the Derwent Superpoint Mini or the Swordfish manual crank handle sharpeners work well with pastel pencils, but the reality is that they do actually work for pastel pencils, but only for a limited time before the blades get blunt. And for me, it lasts about 3 months before my pastels get ruined in the sharpener because the blades are too blunt. And so if you can actually get replacement blades for a decent price in your country and then go for it, that's probably a good way to sharpen your pastel pencils. But for me, I can't get access to any replacement blades for any of those kind of sharpeners here. So I basically have to replace the entire sharpener every 3 months, which is just way too expensive and a waste of time, to be honest. So I've come to the conclusion that the best way to sharpen pastel pencils is actually by using a craft knife. I basically just shave away the wooden casing of the pastel pencil and then use it like that. Because for me, the amount of detail that I can get with a pastel pencil that's just been sharpened with a craft knife is perfect. You don't really need super fine details to make something look realistic. And the reality is that pastel pencils just won't get as sharp as coloured pencils do. And if they do get that sharp, the point will wear away really quickly or it will break. So I try and work just by rotating my pencil as I go and using the edges or the sharper bits on the point of the pencil. And then if I really need a fine point, like if I'm signing the piece or doing whiskers or things like that, and then I'll just use a piece of sandpaper to the side and just sharpen the end until I get a point that's fine enough for what I need. Some people say that sharpening your pastel pencils this way takes too long. Realistically, if you just remove the wooden casing from the pencils you're going to use for that piece at the beginning of the piece, and then I barely have to sharpen my pencils again throughout the entire piece, whereas with the manual sharpeners, I waste so much time trying to retrieve broken leads or continually sharpening it until it's as sharp as I want it to be, or fixing some issue with the manual crank handle sharpener. Whereas this way, I'm not wasting any time, I'm not wasting any pastel, I get to use the entire pastel in the pencil, and it's a much more affordable way of doing it. It just takes a little bit of practice to be able to use the knife and also to work out how to get those details with a point that's not super fine like a coloured pencil, but it's definitely doable because I do it in every pastel piece that I do. I manage to get the amount of detail that I need to using this technique. And that also brings me to another point, which is about the details. So everybody has their own opinion on how much detail they want to put into their pastel pieces. But for me, I find that if I step away from my artwork and look at it from a normal viewing distance and I can't see the detail that I'm adding, it probably doesn't need to be there. The most important thing to making something look realistic is your values. So having your shadows dark enough and your highlights light enough, that's more important than how much detail you have. So if you look closely at my pastel paintings, pretty much none of them have the same amount of detail as like a coloured pencil piece would. And you can't really tell unless your nose is pressed against the artwork. If you're looking at it from a normal distance, it looks realistic. And that's something that the old masters were really good at as well. So if you look at a painting that was done by one of the old masters in a museum or art gallery, you'll notice that it looks realistic from a distance. And then when you go close to it, you can only see sort of brush strokes and colours and a mismatch of things like that put together so that when you stand back, it looks realistic. So it just proves that you don't really need to have super fine details if you don't want to. And of course, if you do want to have super fine details, then go ahead. You can add as much detail as you like. You may just end up spending a lot more time sharpening your pencils if you want to do that. Or another way is that you can work larger so that your details look more detailed. So another thing that people worry about a lot with their pastel artwork or any sort of coloured artwork that they're doing is their colours. People seem to worry about their colour choices quite a bit. And in this one, I used a lot of purple and blue that wasn't in the original reference photo. You don't have to have the perfect colours, and they definitely don't have to be the same as the reference photo. As long as your shadows are dark enough and your highlights are light enough, that's what's going to be what's most important. In this layer, I'm concentrating more on the details, making sure that all of those textures are there, and also paying more attention to my values, so making sure that my shadows are dark enough and my highlights are light enough. And again, you don't need a super sharp point on your pencil. Mine is not really sharp at all. I'm just using the edges of the tip and then rotating it in my hand occasionally to get a sharper edge when I need one. So for me, when I'm drawing something realistic, my top two most important things are getting the outline accurate and getting my values right. Color is way down on the list of things that are most important to making something look realistic. I personally use color to make things more interesting rather than more realistic. So you don't have to have the exact shade of brown that's in the reference photo, as long as you've got the same value. So just as long as your brown isn't too dark or too light in comparison to the brown that's on your reference photo, that's all that matters. It doesn't matter if you have the same hue as the reference photo. And if you put your color down and it looks too red or too blue or too green or whatever, you can tint that color in your next layer by adding other colors on top just to tint it back towards the color that it actually looks like on the reference photo. So you can layer colors on top of each other. It's not really important to get the exact right color every time. And if you're unsure whether your values are right, most people don't have a problem with getting their lights light enough. It's usually their darks that are not dark enough. So something that I do is take a photo of my artwork and then import it onto the computer and turn it into black and white. And I also turn my reference photo into black and white as well, and just compare them side by side. Because that way it's kind of like a spot the difference. You can see if your shadows are as dark as the reference photo and if your highlights are as bright as the reference photo. And that way you can make those changes on your own artwork to get them correct that way. And the way that I work is in layers. So I usually do my entire base layer in the background and then work my way up from there, just sort of adjusting my values as I go and making sure that the shadows are dark enough and that kind of thing as I go along in each layer. Whereas other people like to work on sections at a time. So if it's easier for you to, finish the entire horn, then move on to the other horn and then go for it. If it's too overwhelming to do the entire piece all in layers as you go, you can do that. I just find that doesn't really work well for me because I usually forget the order of the colours that I laid down or what the actual colours were that I laid down and how much of them I put in that section. So when I move on to the second horn, for example, it's not going to look the same or cohesive as the first horn. It almost looks disjointed and like it just doesn't work well for me. So you can work in whatever way works better for you, but I just find that working in layers and building up as I go makes a more cohesive piece. If you want to follow along with the real-time version of this where I talk you through every step of the process, then the link to my Patreon channel is in the description below. Otherwise, there's a playlist on the screen with some other pastel tutorials that I thought you might find useful, so click on that and I'll see you over there.